Well, thank you everybody for joining us again for the last session of the third day of the Enterprise UX Virtual Summit. It's been so exciting having everybody here around the world joining us in this virtual conference. And today here we have Jack Moffett, who is a UX manager at Inmedius, and he has just years of experience in user experience as well as in the enterprise space. He wrote a book published by Morgan Kaufman called Bridging Web Design and Development. I'm going to drop that link for you guys here in the chat box in just a moment. We actually have that book, so we actually really recommend getting that. We have a UX bookshelf at our office. Yeah, today Jack is going to be talking about design debt and some of the challenges and solutions that he's sort of evolved. And so, with that being said, Jack, I'll hand this over to you.
Great, thanks for that introduction. Um, yeah, so I've been thinking about UX debt for some time now, and when I talk to other people about it, especially at conferences, when they ask me what I'm talking about, and I say, "Oh, I'm speaking on managing UX debt," I usually get one of two responses from them. They either understand what I'm talking about, and they say, "Oh, yeah, we've got a lot of that," or they don't know what I'm talking about, and they say, "Oh, UX debt, what is that?" So whichever camp you happen to be in, I think I can help you today. Um, you may recognize Wimpy there on my title slide from the Popeye comic strip. Wimpy's always trying to get other people to pay for his food, and he promises that he'll pay them back on Tuesday when he gets his paycheck. Now, of course, Wimpy doesn't have any actual intention of paying back his debt, and he gets into a lot of trouble for it. Um, I'm not the first one to use the term UX debt. In fact, it came from, of course, the term technical debt, which was coined by Ward Cunningham back in 1992. But I heard the developers that I work with use the term one time, technical debt, and I thought, I really like that term. That there's a lot of meaning behind that, and I immediately started thinking about how that applies to UX as well. Um, so it's for those of you who aren't familiar with the term. Of course, it's a financial metaphor, right? If you think about financial debt, you'll take on you'll take on debt to purchase a house or a car or an education before you can afford it, right? And you do that with the knowledge that you're going to have to pay that debt back, and that the longer it takes you to pay that debt, the uh, the more um, the more it's going to cost you in the long run because of the interest, right? Um, so that's intentional debt. That's intent that you debt that you take on purposefully for some benefit. And then there's unintentional debt, right? Like if you accidentally run up your credit card bill too high, right? So there are both kinds of debt that we can talk about in terms of UX. But before I get any farther, let's go ahead and define what UX debt is. UX debt is the accumulation of decisions made during design and development that negatively impact the users of a product or a service. There are many sources of both intentional and unintentional debt, and understanding those sources helps us guard against it, or at least track it. Now, you all are probably going to get hungry by the end of this talk, so hopefully those of you on the West Coast got a good lunch. But I'm going to go through what I call the big three sources of UX debt, and those are acquisition, outsourcing, and neglect. We'll start with acquisition. So um, once upon a time, there was a company called Macromedia, right? And they had this application called Flash, which was gaining popularity. And there was this other company named Adobe. You might have heard of them. And they were trying to get more involved in the web space. And they saw this application Flash, and they decided, we want some of that, right? And so they gobbled up Macromedia. They acquired the company, and as part of that, they acquired Flash. Now, this is what Flash looked like in 2005 when it was acquired. This is what it looked like in 2007 after Adobe released CS3 Professional. Now, there are obviously some significant differences between the two. Adobe had to do a lot of work to make Flash consistent with the rest of their suite of products. Everything from changing iconography to the terminology used in menus to the way their tools looked and perhaps even behavior of some of them, right? So it took them 3 years, and they did it over the same period of time that they were making other significant changes to their suite and finally rolled out that CS3 suite. So what can we learn from this? First, that UX should be involved in the evaluation of products that are under consideration for acquisition. You're not necessarily going to be the ones making any final decisions about whether or not they should be acquired, but you should at least be aware of what's coming down the pike and document that debt as soon as the acquisition occurs so that you can track it and develop strategies to deal with it. Now, that's one way. That's one way of taking on debt. What if you want to build a new product or add a major new feature, but all of your personnel are fully engaged on other products? This is a point where your company might decide to outsource, right? You might bring in some contractors or hire another company to build something for you. Now, chances are that firm doesn't necessarily have the same priorities that yours does, or the same sensibilities that you do, or the same design philosophies and approaches that you all have. There was a period of time that there was a point in time that my company wanted to add a major new feature to one of our products. We called it the library, and my design team had done the design and specification and document. We were all ready to work with the developers to actually implement it. That specification document was delivered to our CEO at the time, and then we didn't hear anything else about it for quite a long time. And then suddenly, some months later, all of a sudden, that feature was in our product. And had no idea how it got there, but it turned out that our CEO had taken that specification document to a firm in India and had them implement the feature without any collaboration between us. In fact, what they did is they took screenshots of the screens in the specification document to create graphics to build the UI out of. It was a mess, you can imagine. It took me years to get rid of the debt that was in our product from that. So what can we learn from that? Well, UX should collaborate closely with contractors. You've got to set clear expectations at the outset of what is expected from your collaboration, how you're going to collaborate, what kinds of deliverables you're expecting, what the timeline is going to be, all that kind of thing. Schedule regular quality checks and involvement from all parts of your team. Design, development, testing, management, everybody should be involved with that. Now, how many of you out there have a product sitting around that looks like this, right? It's kind of rusty. There are weeds growing up through it. You know, nobody wants to look under that hood. Acquisition and outsourcing are both easily identified and planned for, but neglect is a silent killer. If you're a small UX team that's part of a big company, it's really easy for little issues to kind of slide by unnoticed. And they build up over time, right? They accumulate, and they have a negative impact on the user experience of your product. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. So often it's unintentional, but sometimes neglect isn't even accidental. That there was a product manager that I didn't get along very well with at one point in time, and I was perfectly happy working on other products, other projects within the company, and so meanwhile, certain products went along without much of my involvement at all. I kind of did the la 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 kind of thing and ignored it for a time, and all kinds of UX debt built up in that product over time. And of course, then later, when that product manager was no longer with us, it was my responsibility. I was given the task to improve those products and get rid of all that debt. So what can we learn from that? Put processes in place that assure awareness of all of your development efforts that are going on, that you're not left out, that you're in the loop, that you know what's happening. Team dynamics here are hugely important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. The book that was mentioned earlier is all about that, working with developers and other members of your team. Very, very important. And resist, don't do what I did in that situation. Resist the urge to turn a blind eye to things that you don't feel like working on. Learn from my mistake. Okay, so those were the big three: acquisition, outsourcing, and neglect. Now, there are three additional sources of intentional UX debt. They're smaller burgers, but still really meaty. The first one is resistance to change. So, our users get invested in our products, and they don't like change, right? And so we end up sometimes leaving old stuff in our products that we know, yeah, we came up with this better way to do it, and it's going to save them 5 clicks, and it's going to be so much better for them, and they're going to like it better, but they're going to be unhappy if we force them to change, so we leave the old way in too, right? So that's something you've got to track that, because you know that at some point you want to remove it. That's UX debt. Incremental enhancement. We have very few opportunities to redesign something completely from scratch. And so we want to introduce this new widget or this new improvement. And so, we're working on this screen, and we say, okay, we'll introduce it here, and then we'll roll it out through the rest of the product as we have the chance, right? And so the product kind of becomes a patchwork quilt, because you've got some new stuff here and some old stuff here. And again, that's debt, and you just need to keep track of that so that you can address it in the future and you don't forget about it. And then there are actually product management strategies that can result in debt. I'm going to give you 4 of those. Focusing on new features. If you spend a lot of time just adding features without improving the existing ones, that can be a source of debt. If your team is focused on fulfilling customer requests, right? And so, yeah, you fulfill that request and you fulfill that request, and meanwhile, you're not giving enough attention to other things in the product. That's a source of debt. If you're always focused on time to market, like the manager that I was talking about earlier, no time for design, no time for testing, get it in the product, get it to market, that's going to be a major source of debt. And again, there are some benefits that you're hopefully getting from these strategies, but you have to track the debt and have a plan for addressing it. And then backwards compatibility. This is one, Microsoft is well known for this, right? Especially IE compatibility mode comes to mind on this one. So for those intentional debt items, like I said, you're hopefully getting some benefit from those, but unintentional debt you have to treat more like a disease. You have to cure the disease rather than just attacking the symptoms. So I'm going to give you several sources of unintentional debt. There are probably others, but this is a list that I've compiled. The first one, real easy, mistakes and laziness. One of the developers I worked with said, broken gets fixed, but shoddy lasts forever, and it rings true. Another one, just lack of design, of course. Now, fortunately, this one's becoming much less prevalent in recent years in the enterprise space as more and more companies hire on internal teams. But even when they have teams, often there's this lack of empowerment. They don't have the senior management support that they need. So that can be a source of debt. This is a big one, and this especially in enterprise companies, this separation of design and development, where many times the UX team is like their own island within the company, and sometimes they're responsible for their own revenue generation, and they have their own goals that they have to meet, and so they end up spending more time trying to sell their services to the other teams within the company than they do doing design. And of course, the other teams, they're strapped for cash too. So why should I pay your team to? It's just not a real good situation for a UX team to be in. Just having too many cooks in the kitchen. You have to standardize your practice, right? So that you make sure that your entire team is following the same design philosophies, using the same approaches, the same tools. We've got to work on that standardization of practice. And then just customer inefficiencies, right? There can be a lot of roadblocks in large organizations. I've done a lot of work with the military as well. That's a huge issue there. So with all these sources of debt, all of these hamburgers falling from the sky, how in the world can we keep up? What are we going to do about all this debt? Well, we need to identify it, we need to classify it, we need to track it and address it. I'm going to give you 3 techniques for identifying UX debt. And those are active peripheral awareness, UX debt inventory, and user exposure. So sometimes, do you ever feel like this when you're working, right? You're really focused on what you're doing. You've got your blinders up. What I ask you to do is practice active peripheral awareness. And what I mean by that, active because it's something you're actively doing. It's not just in the background. You have to think about it. But peripheral because it's not the focus of what you're doing at a given point of time. It's in your peripheral vision. Any time that anybody is interacting with your product, be it one of your developers just doing their work, whether it's a member of your sales team demoing to a customer, somebody else on your UX team, certainly if it's a user or a customer. Make sure you're observing, and anything you notice, even the tiniest issue, needs to be written down and recorded. Too often, we'll notice something, and we'll say, "Oh yeah, we ought to do something about that later," but we don't actually record it and track it as a bug, and then we'll see it again later and say, "Oh yeah, I need to get to that." Right? So we need to make sure that we are writing things down and keeping track of them. Along with that, keep an awareness of technology. Your UX team should be contributing to decisions made by your organization about the tech stack that they're using. That's very important because those decisions result in limitations that you have to live with. And then awareness of your own design practice. What are the things that your team are doing that are causing debt, and what could you be doing to protect against it? So just being aware of that and thinking about ways to improve your design practice. So awareness helps when you are establishing a product, or when you have an established product, right? But if you're starting fresh, if you maybe you just acquired a product, right, and it's coming in and you know that there's debt in there and so forth, you can jumpstart by creating a UX debt inventory. So it's very simple, and it's also referred to as expert review. Just use the product, take notes, or better yet, have a teammate take notes and then switch, and you take notes while they use the product. You can get quite a list of things that, just by doing that, very simply. Now, of course, we aren't the users, so you do have to validate it by observing and talking with users. But once you've done that and you start recording these things, and you can start creating this inventory. So you can see here, I have a column with short descriptions. I've got this, we're missing some counts in our search facet results. We've got an inconsistent delete icon, and then there's the impact. What is the impact that this causes? Well, some screens use this X icon, and others use a trash can, and this could cause confusion in users about what they're for. And we'll get to filling in these other columns as we go through the rest of the presentation. The next thing is to expose your team. And again, this may seem obvious, but it's very important. Jared Spool says, "It seems that 6 weeks was the bare minimum for a 2-hour exposure dose. The teams with members who spent the minimum of 2 hours every 6 weeks saw far greater improvements to their design's user experience than teams who didn't meet the minimum." Okay, this is from his article, "Fast Path to a Great UX, Increased Exposure Hours." And teams with more frequent exposure, say 2 hours every 3 weeks, saw even better results. And furthermore, he relates that companies that included everyone in this, not just the UX team, but developers and managers and so forth, that they had even better results. Okay, so we've identified our debt. The next step is to classify it. We have to determine what's harder or easier to fix, and who's responsible, and when it makes sense to tackle an issue. So there are 4 UX debt categories that I use to classify my debt. You might find some other categories that are useful for you, but this is the way I do it. And I will sometimes even subcategorize. So technical, well, you may be thinking, well, why is he bringing up technical debt? We already established that's something that the developers already talk about and use. Yeah, but remember, anything that impacts the user experience is UX debt. So technical debt, a lot of technical debt will be UX debt. So I'll classify it that way. Under technical debt, you can subclassify it as back-end. So we've got performance issues, database issues. How many times have you gone to your developers and they say, no, we can't do that. The database isn't set up in the way that makes that query possible. And security issues would fall under that category. Front-end debt would be things like browser version support. If you have an outdated framework or really old HTML table-based layouts or heaven forbid frame sets. And poor coding practices. Again, I talk about that a lot in the book that was mentioned earlier. Using really good OOCSS practices, atomic design, things like that, so that you have clean, reusable code. Then there's functional debt. And so here we're talking about things like scale. Is your product able to support the number of users or the amount of data that it needs to? This includes your information architecture, right? Is the content within your system findable, searchable? The priority of functions, right? Which things are immediately available and which things are tucked away under a menu or a couple clicks away. And these things can change over time. Then you've got your behavioral debt. And the first one I'll mention here is tool time. So again, this is something Jared Spool has talked about, tool time versus goal time. Tool time is anything that doesn't add to the quality of the result of what the user is doing with your system, right? It's the time that they spend futzing with your UI rather than goal time, which is the time they actually spend doing the work to reach their goal. So you want to reduce tool time. Consistency, consistency issues would be categorized here, very important. And then I actually keep separately here conventions, because a convention is a formalized consistency. You create a convention when you recognize an intentional consistency and you document it as a rule. And then there's visual. Your UI Chrome, the iconography, visual consistency across your UI, even fashion, right? Are we going to go flat this year? Your branding plays into this. Does the branding, the visual branding within your UI match the branding that your organization is putting out? And copywriting plays into this as well. So you had those 4 UX debt categories. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. There are actually 5 UX debt categories. There's one that often gets forgotten, and that is documentation. Documentation is very important that you keep your documentation up to date. A lot of people forget about that. So now that you have these categories and you start classifying things, right, we can fill in our type column here, where you have these missing result counts in the search facets I've classified as technical performance, whereas the delete icon is visual iconography, right? And so now this gives you a way to start figuring out what kinds of debt you have. Okay, so you have debt, you've identified it, you've classified it. Now what are you going to do about it? Design tends to be a pretty optimistic, positive force, right? We know we have a process that we can follow to improve things. We know we can make things better. So sometimes it's hard to throw in the towel or admit defeat, but sometimes it makes sense to declare bankruptcy. Um, Steve Jobs famously said, "People think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on, but that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that there are. You have to pick carefully. I'm actually as proud of the things we haven't done as the things I have done. Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things." So, you may have this product that is so riddled with debt that it would just take way too much time and way too many resources to save it. And there may be other things that are much more important for you to be focusing on. So just realize that it's not a failure if it enables other products to be successful. Or maybe that product you decide is central to your organization's strategy. Maybe you think that this has an important place in the future of your company. You could call a do-over, right? You could redesign and rebuild that thing from the ground up. And my team just finished doing that. We spent the past year taking a product that we thought was strategically valuable to us, and we sucked it up. We did a complete redesign and rebuilt the thing from scratch. Um, and we'll find out, but it looks like it's going to be a big success for us now. But sometimes that's too risky. You just can't take that risk. So maybe you want to skunk work it, right? Have a tiger team on the side that is working on the new thing while your core team is still maintaining the existing product, doing patches, making releases. That way you aren't completely dependent on the new thing, but you're not stuck in the past either. Now, those are all approaches for unmanageable debt. But if you can go through your debt inventory and you can start penciling in, a rough order of magnitude estimates for how long it'll take to fix each one, then your debt is probably manageable. And if that's the case, then I would recommend taking a phased approach. And I'll give you a 3-step process for that. Step 1 is prioritization. And so you have to start thinking about severity and impact. So how big is the issue? Is it keeping people from doing their work? Is it creating a safety or security risk? And what's the impact going to be if you do fix it? How big an improvement are the users going to see? Is it going to save hours per month? Is it going to reduce the number of errors they create? So those things are really important when it comes to prioritizing. Then you've got to think about the estimated time to address it. Is it going to be a really quick CSS tweak? Or is it going to require a full regression test of the entire product? And who's responsible for fixing it? Is it something that one of your designers can take care of real quickly, or is it something that's going to require 2 or 3 of your developers for a couple weeks? So once you figure those kind of things out, then you can start filling out the rest of these columns, right? So I have a column for severity and a column for priority. And those are 2 different things, right? Just because something is of minor severity, it may be just a really easy fix, so you give it a high priority because you just want to get it done in the next release. And then you add your ROMs. That ROM stands for rough order of magnitude. How long is it going to take? Whose responsibility it is, right? And so now you have this inventory where you can start looking at it and saying, okay, what do we want to do next? Which things do we think are most important? Which are the quickest that we can turn out? Another benefit of this is that as your company decides, okay, we're going to do something on this screen or in this part of the product, you can come back to this inventory and you can find, oh, okay, well, we have 5 pieces of UX debt involved with that screen. Maybe this is the time for us to address those. So that's step 1. Step 2 is, of course, to schedule it. Now, there are different ways to approach this, and it depends on how your company works. So I believe there are different degrees of being agile, but for the purposes of this talk, let's just say we have agile and we have not agile. So if you're not agile, your work's probably planned based on a release cycle or contract period. I recommend handling your UX debt issues the same way as you handle any other bug in your system, whether you're logging those in Jira or Bugzilla or some other tool. Do it the same way so that they're treated the same way. They go through the same process. Make sure you have a UX team representative on your issue review board. Make sure you're working with your product management when they're scheduling releases to get this stuff in there. Now, if you're agile and you're using a healthy agile process, you shouldn't have any problem, right? Assign story points, fit it into your sprints. Of course, a lot of organizations that I've witnessed, they use agile to mean get more work done faster rather than the iterative improvement that it was intended for. If that's the case, just make sure that you find a rhythm for addressing your debt. Maybe you want to assign a certain number of points per sprint, or maybe you want to every so many sprints have a payback sprint where you just address debt, and do that regularly, at least until your backlog of historic debt has been repaid. Okay, and then the third step, well, it's not really a step. The third step is collaboration. You've got to make sure that your entire organization understands that UX debt is their responsibility. It's not just the UX team's responsibility. Your development team, product management, they all have a responsibility to play here. Okay, so once you've addressed your debt, you're in pretty good shape, but you need to make sure you avoid taking on more debt. The first key is to understand where it comes from. We've already talked about that. I'll give you 4 practices that will help you lower the risk of acquiring unintentional debt. The first one, usability research and testing. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but a decision informed by firsthand knowledge of your users and their tasks is less likely to result in debt than one based on any other information source. Pay attention to details. Dan Saffer's book, Micro Interactions, is a good source for this. A lot of debt is hiding out in those little details. Modularity is a real plus. Using a design system, building modular components that can be reused throughout a product or across products, because once you fix a piece of debt in one place, it automatically fixes it everywhere that's used. It's a magical thing. And again, documentation. Documentation shouldn't be a step in the process. Certainly not something that waits till the end. It should be happening throughout. Documenting your design should be indistinguishable from designing. Your documentation becomes a force field against UX debt because you have a single source of truth that you can test the current state against. So please, I beg you, uh, don't bite off more than you can chew, but manage your UX debt and don't be a wimpy. Thank you all very much. And if you want to learn more, you can download the free book that ebook I wrote for UX Pen.
Thanks, Jack. That was fantastic here. And let me drop in the links here at the end. So the first link again is for the book that Jack wrote with Morgan Kaufman. It's a very comprehensive and useful and technical book. It is called Bridging UX and Web Development. So there's a lot of good advice in there, but on the more proactive end to avoid design debt. And then, of course, Jack also helped create an ebook for us on today's topic in more depth, which is Eliminate UX Debt. So here is the second one. And of course, that is a free ebook. And just to quickly wrap up some housekeeping items here. So if you want to follow along with the conversation, the hashtag is hashtag EUX Summit 2017. I'm going to run a quick poll at the end here. And unfortunately, this doesn't detect if you've already taken the poll before. So apologize if you have to retake it here. But all this information aggregated at the end will help us better mold our content to continue suiting everybody here. So let me go ahead and drop that in there. And with that being said, let's get into some of the questions here. So cool, we've got some good questions. So the first question is actually about documentation and talking about how you keep people on the same page. So what documentation have you found useful in the design process for helping to sort of mitigate this design debt? Is it a product requirements document? Is it a very clear design brief? What sort of assets there have been helpful to you?
Certainly, requirements documents are helpful, and we use those. The primary documents I'm talking about are the actual user interface specifications, the ones that say, when you click on this button, this is what's supposed to happen. And not just that, but this button enables in this state, and this field has these requirements, whether it's a required field or it only accepts these types of characters. All of those details, you've got to have those documented.
Right. And we have another, actually several questions along this theme here, which is, how do we actually convince project teams or the business in general to take care of debt? Because especially in the enterprise, right, where it's so easy for sales teams to just come along and say, well, we need these new features because this potential deal has said they would buy if we have feature A, B, and C. And it becomes a bit more difficult to get buy-in for resources to actually fix some existing design.
Yeah, the thing that's worked for me is to explain to them how the debt that is currently in the system prevents us from doing something, or makes it take longer, or makes it more expensive for us to do something. Certainly a lot of technical debt is good for that, but also showing particular pieces of usability, usability issues and so forth that is really impacting your customers.
Right. And on a related question here, so we have somebody here who they have UX debt in the product because, again, parts of these products were created to win, a big deal, and of course that mandate came directly from executives, right? Instead of going through that normal product development process. And now that they're in this situation, how can this person address those pieces of debt without hurting egos? Is it sort of the same tactic that you just described, or would you recommend something different?
Yeah, it really is. If you can show proof, right, and it's not just coming from you, right? It's not just coming from one person. It's coming from the team. Then that's something that, excuse me, I got a little distracted. A police car just pulled up in front of our office. Yeah, so make sure, it's not just coming from one person. It's something that the entire team is in agreement on. That makes it a little harder for somebody to just resist for those kinds of reasons.
Gotcha. And the next question we've got here is this is actually very interesting, and I see that this is extremely relevant for really large companies with huge products. Kind of Salesforce, for instance, sort of comes to mind here. But somebody's wondering, how do you handle the use of vendor products or software? So, for instance, if you as a design organization, right, release products that other vendors can then use and customize for their needs, for their
Right.
customers, how do you ensure consistency and sort of ensure that that doesn't just end up becoming sort of just a spiral into design and technical debt because you no longer control all the executions of those assets or those toolkits you're providing?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a little harder if you're giving up control and allowing customization. Then that's part of what you're offering, and you don't have control of that anymore. Now you can try to mitigate that by providing guides or examples for recommendations for them to follow.
Right. And obviously that's sort of what in this case what Salesforce Lightning has sort of strived to achieve is
Right.
create this large design system that doesn't just govern the product itself, but also can act as guidelines for other people who have to customize that product.
Yep.
And actually here we've got a question about distinguishing when design debt is either good or acceptable. So are there ever instances um, in which it's acceptable for design debt to linger for, even up to years before you address it sooner? Have you ever been in that situation where that just had to be the order of the day?
Yeah. Yeah. I've had to live with a lot of debt for a long time. Still am. But again, you're making decisions, and hopefully you're benefiting from the fact that you're pushing that off, right? You're saying there's something else that we need to spend our time on that has to wait. So there's a benefit. The point is you need to make sure that you're tracking that piece of debt, that it isn't just getting lost. Too many times, I've talked to a lot of designers and a lot of teams about this, and they don't have a formalized way of handling it. They know it's in there, but they aren't tracking it, and they don't have a strategy for dealing with it.
Right. And here's as speaking of tracking that technical debt. So how might you go about capturing that UX debt when decisions or compromises are created without designer involvement? So when collaboration isn't a natural part of the process, how
Mm.
do you capture and then share that knowledge about existing design debt?
Well, I mean, it starts with you. You've got to start by making that inventory, right? And then once you have that, then you need to find some way to start communicating that and injecting that. The way I've done it is that I started using the same tools that my developers were using. They were using Jira, so I started using Jira. And now I use Jira for all of my design. All of my design team's tasks are in Jira, the same as the developers' tasks are in Jira. We just use the same tools, and in doing that, it it doesn't necessarily force collaboration, but it certainly enables it.
Right. Oh, I guess we lost Jack there for a second. We'll have him back on in a moment. Don't worry about that. All right, let me see. Where did Jack go? Yeah, it was the sirens, right? There we go. He should be joining us shortly. Yeah, it was the debt police. You guys are right. All right. He'll be joining us in just a moment there. Okay. But yeah, keep up the great questions. We've got a lot here that are very relevant, I think practical to enterprise design. Let's see here. Okay, just hang with us for a moment here while I ping him, and we will get into this. Okay, let me give him the URL again. Just give us a moment here while I reconnect with him, and we should get this back on track with the Q&A. Yeah, just to answer the questions here, this will be recorded and sent to everybody afterwards, just like with all of the sessions. So if you got to jump off, no problem. That's actually a good idea here. Let's see. And Jack is back. He's just signed back on.
About that.
Oh,
I wasn't plugged into power and my battery went out.
that would explain it. People were wondering that the debt police had come for you.
Yeah. So sorry about that.
Yeah, that was no, we're doing great here. Well, let's get right back into it. Thanks everybody for bearing with us. It's the joys of doing large global events here. Okay, great. So getting right back into the questions. So this is actually a very relevant question for agile processes, especially in the enterprise, which is, so this person often struggles with design debt because of the MVP process. So usually when they're building the MVP, there's certain elements that just are de-scoped for the MVP.
Yes.
And then once that MVP gets back to the development team, they realize that there's just so many fire drills that those elements that were de-scoped just don't make it into the process. And instead, this sort of satisficing MVP just gets rolled out the door. And in that situation, as you can imagine, design debt can very easily build up over time as you repeat that cycle multiple times. Would you have any recommendations for how to either work with a different process or modify the existing process so that these effects are mitigated?
Yeah, so I mentioned that you need to make sure that you have a representative from your UX team who is working with the product management and especially involved on the if you have like an issue review board or something like that, right? That they're engaged in those conversations about what's most important, what are the things we need to do next, so that you can start feeding those things in there and making the case for them. And I tell you what, when it comes, like I said, relationships are so important. Something is, I have lunch every Friday with a group of the developers and my product manager. We go out to lunch every Friday, and it's really hard to jerk somebody around when you're enjoying lunch with them every week. Um, so it really is a relationship, building trust, building respect, so that when you are making a case for something, people are listening to you.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the next question we have here is, so are there any metrics that you use to either measure the extent of design debt or to measure progress against eliminating design
Hmm.
debt?
Yeah, so um, again, if you have that inventory, right, and you have all those columns filled in, then you can start totaling, right? So here's the number of issues we have, or here's the amount of time, right, that we have estimated against our issues, all right? And you can do that either in total or by category, and then you can track that. You can track those numbers and see how they're trending down, hopefully, over time.
Right, right. So almost like a little design debt kind of burn down chart.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And I think the last question we've got from somebody again goes back to documentation, and she's just wondering, have you found any tools useful for documentation management so that somebody can immediately see if a product is working like the current version, or if if there's been different versions of documentation for different products, and just to kind of keep track of all the versioning out there.
Right. Yeah. So what works for us, and again, it depends on the tools that your team uses. My developers are heavily invested in their wiki, right? We use the whole Atlassian suite, right? So we're on Confluence. Um, and they have all of their information, their designs, architectures, everything that is in the wiki. So I make sure that our specifications are in the wiki, and that wiki anytime we publish a new version of a spec, I upload it to the wiki, and the wiki has the history of versions in it. So that's how I make it easily available, and then that can link obviously into Jira tasks and so forth. Aside from that, we use Subversion, and so I check all of my design artifacts into Subversion the same way the developers check their code in. And so everything is versioned that way.
Right, right. And I think the last question we'll take here, since we are pushing up on the end of the session, is, and this is actually, I think, very interesting and a good way to close us out, is, have you found any useful ways of visualizing design debt? Because tables in Jira seem sometimes a little bit flat. Are there any diagrams or any ways that you found useful for somebody to kind of instantly see and kind of interpret the scope of design debt?
I haven't done that yet, to be honest, though that sounds like something that would certainly be worth exploring.
Gotcha. Great. Well, everybody, that is the last question that we will take, and that is the last session of the day for the third day of the Enterprise UX Virtual Summit. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today and has joined us from the previous sessions. Jack, thank you very much for this insightful session. I've been monitoring the chat, and the feedback has been great. People totally identify with the pains that you explained, and they found the steps you described to be very practical and something that they can try for themselves. So yeah, thank you for taking the time here, and again, thanks to the audience for the patience in working through some of the little bugs we had at the end with the Q&A. Tomorrow in the morning, we are going to have a panel discussion with a couple of folks who've worked a long time in enterprise products, and then we will wrap that up with a few more sessions in the afternoon, and that will conclude our 2017 Enterprise UX Virtual Summit. So I hope to see everybody there in the morning and throughout tomorrow's day. Once more, if you'd like to follow along on Twitter, the hashtag is EUX Summit 2017, and I just dropped it there for everybody who's joining us here today. And again, yeah, Jack, you did a great job. Everybody else, hope to see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day. And yeah, take care. See you guys bright and early tomorrow.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This was fantastic. Take care, Jack.
Bye.
All right, bye.